All right, so some common threats and attacks. This section or this module is going to be describing threats and attacks in more detail, understanding the topic of malware, some common network attacks, as well as other deeper network attacks like denial of service, buffer overflow, and evasion. In malware, malware is going to be some code or some software designed to damage, disrupt, steal, or inflict some other bad or illegitimate action on the network. The three most common types of malware are going to be your viruses, your worms, and your Trojan horses. And you can see with this animation that explain the different types between there. Viruses are going to be a type of malware that spreads by inserting a copy of itself into another program. Once that program is ran, then the virus spreads from computer to computer, thus infecting other computers. A simple virus may install itself at the first line of code of the executable. Viruses can be harmless, and for those to display a picture on a screen, or they can be destructive. They typically modify or delete files on the hard drive system. Most viruses spread by USB memory drives. For example, CDs, DVDs, network shares, and email. Email viruses are a common type of virus. Trojan horses, these are going to be some malware that is a software that appears to be legitimate, but it contains malicious code, which exploits the privileges of the user that runs it. Typically, these are attached to online games. They're also attached to where you would normally download software online that you think is legitimate, but it's some third party hosting these, quote, legitimate files. They look legitimate. The software works exactly as you intend it, but in the background, it's grabbing and tracing a bunch of information. So a Trojan horse concept is kind of flexible. It can do immediate damage and provide remote access to the system, or access it through a backdoor. Custom written Trojan horses with a specific target are difficult to detect. So when you write things like these, if it's something brand new and it's really narrowed down, a lot of times your antiviruses and your other software used to detect this stuff won't actually pick it up right away. A Trojan horse classification is typically according to the damage they cause or the manner in which they breach the system. So if they're there to destroy, just enable remote access or transmit a password. So here's some classifications of Trojan horses. For example, remote access we covered. They can also be data sending, where they're just sending sensitive data. Destructive, where they're corrupting or deleting files. A proxy is going to use a victim's computer to launch another attack. An FTP is going to be an unauthorized file transfer. Security software disabler, simply just stopping antivirus and firewalls within the local machine. You have denial of service attacks. These are going to slow or halt network activity. And then a keylogger, which is going to be trying to steal confidential information, such as credit card numbers you type in, as it's recording keystrokes from a web form or even from the keyboard itself. Worms, computer worms are going to be similar to viruses, but they replicate themselves by independently exploiting vulnerabilities within the network. So worms can slow down a network as they spread from system to system. Worms can run without a host program. However, typically once a host is infected, the worm spreads rapidly over the network. And in 2001, Code Red was a worm that initially infected about 658 servers. And then within about 19 hours, that worm had infected over 300,000 servers. So you can kind of see how that exploited across the world over here. Looks like it, it kind of originated in the U.S. and the edges of Russia over there, and then just really took off after that. So an initial infection was within a SQL Slammer worm. It's known as a worm that ate the internet. The SQL Slammer was a denial of service attack that exploited a buffer overflow bug in Microsoft SQL Server. The number of infected servers doubled in size every 8.5 seconds. The infected servers did not have an updated patch that was released 6 months prior. Hence, the essential for organizations to implement a security policy requiring updates and patches be applied in a timely fashion. So you can see here within 30 minutes, it spread extremely fast. There we go. So what are worm components? You can see that here within this diagram. This will be in your module. The idea is it's going to enable vulnerability. So the worm installs itself with an exploit mechanism, such as an email attachment or an executable file, or even a Trojan horse in order to get vulnerable systems. Then they will propagate by gaining access to a device. The worm will replicate itself to locate new targets. And then the payload itself, which is the malicious code that results in some action, is referred to as a payload. Most often, this is creating a backdoor or allowing threat actors to access the infected host and create another denial of service attack. So again, they're self-contained little programs that are used to exploit a known vulnerability. Upon successful exploitation, the worm will copy itself with attacking host to the newly exploited system, and the cycle begins all over again. So this will propagate as you see here. Worms never stop spreading on the internet. After they are released, the worms will continue to propagate until all the possible sources of infection are properly patched. So again, it will go on forever until all the systems are patched as a whole. Ransomware, this is one I referred to earlier as one that are typically done by cyber criminals in the black hat realm. Ransomware is going to be malware that denies the infected systems access to the system as well as the data that's inside of it. Frequently, they use an encryption algorithm to encrypt those system files and data. Email and malicious advertising, known as malvertising, are vectors for ransomware campaigns. Social media or social engineering can be used when cyber criminals are pretending to be security technicians and make random calls to houses and persuade users to connect to a website that downloads ransomware to a user's machine. This is all too common today. So other types of malware, you have scareware, which is just a scam software used to social engineering and shock and induce anxiety with the perception of there actually being a threat. It is generally directed at an unsuspecting user and attempts to persuade them to infect a computer by taking action of going to an address with a bogus threat. We have phishing. This is typically done with your email. This is going to get people to divulge sensitive information. So receiving an email from a bank that asks users to divulge their account or their PIN numbers. We have rootkits. These are going to be installed on a compromised system, and after it's installed, it will hide intrusion and provide privileged access to the threat actor. Very hard to get rid of. Spyware itself is going to be information that's gathered from a user and sent to an information from another entity without the user's consent. This can be very simple, just as a system monitor with a Trojan horse, adware, tracking cookies, keyloggers, etc. They don't really do damage. They're just collecting information and sending it off, which obviously could be damage in and of itself. Adware is going to be those annoying pop-ups that generate revenue for its author. The malware may analyze the user's interest by tracking your websites visited. It can send a pop-up advertising pertinent to those sites. I guess we can call Facebook adware because that's similar to what they're doing. All right. Computer infections with malware often exhibit at least one or more of the following symptoms. You have the appearance of strange files or programs or desktop icons that you're not familiar with. Antivirus program files are turned off and their settings are reconfigured. The computer screen's freezing or crashing. Emails are spontaneously being sent. You can have increased CPU or maybe files are changed. Problems connecting to other networks. Just general slow computer. And a bunch of unknown services running or just general strange behavior. And obviously it's not limited to this list. This is just an overall idea of what you could be seeing. So you'll have a lab in this module that will take you through and analyze what happened with some recent malware. All right, so here's some common network attacks based on reconnaissance access and social engineering. So malware is meant to get a payload delivered, and when that payload is delivered and installed, it can be used to cause a variety of network-related attacks from the inside as well as from the outside. So there's three main categories. You have reconnaissance attacks, access attacks, and denial of service attacks. So with your reconnaissance attacks, these are simply just information gathering. The goal here is to use these attacks to gain unauthorized discovery or mapping of a system, services, and all the vulnerabilities. Recon attacks will precede access to attacks and denial of service attacks. So your goal within a reconnaissance attack is simply to gather information and query of a target. You may do a ping sweep in order to target the network and find out what's all out there. You could initiate a port scan of active IP addresses. Then you run some vulnerability scanners against that information that you have collected to find out what all could be vulnerable. And then you may run some exploitation tools in order to find out whether or not those are actually exploitable. And so you can see some queries here within the diagram that they give you out in your content. And as well as performing a ping scan, and then the reconnaissance attacks there. So attacks here within the access, these are known as vulnerabilities to authenticate you against services, for example, FTP services or web services, and then gain entry into those accounts, confidential databases, and other sensitive information. Password attacks are going to be used to discover critical system passwords. And spoofing, as we mentioned before, spoofing is going to be when you're looking to mimic another IP address or MAC address, or maybe doing DHCP spoofing. The idea is that they are trusted exploitations. We could do port redirections, man-in-the-middle attacks, and buffer overflows. All right, social engineering attacks. These are going to be used to manipulate individuals into performing actions or divulging information from confidential information. Social engineering techniques are typically performed in person or via telephone or the internet itself. And these techniques can be explained in this table here. So you have pretexting. This is what's called when a threat actor pretends to need personal or financial information to confirm an identity of a recipient. They will then use phishing, which is going to be typically a fraudulent email that's disguising itself as being legitimate from a trusted source, and then trick that recipient into installing malware on their device or just sharing personal or financial information. You have spear phishing, in which they have a targeted phishing attack tailored for a specific individual or organization. So the difference between the two is the one is just kind of a broad concept to see if somebody will respond, where the other one is very much tailored for the specific individual or maybe that organization. In other words, they may try to use the CEO says that they have an urgent email and they must get you to respond. Please enter in some information. They're in the middle of a meeting, etc. Those are called spear phishing emails. Your spam, otherwise known as junk email, is just unsolicited email that often contains harmful links, malware, or deceptive content. Something for something, these are often your quid pro quos. These are going to be where the threat actor requests financial or personal information from a party in exchange for something such as a gift. You also have baiting, in which a threat actor will leave a malware-infected flash drive in a public location. So you put a nice shiny 32 gig or 128 gig drive out in the parking lot, wait for that victim to find that drive, insert it into their laptop, unintentionally installing malware. You have impersonation, in which the threat actor pretends to be somebody else to gain trust. Tailgating, which is just going to follow somebody into a secured location. This can be as simple as you thinking of somebody opening access to a 24-hour gym and you just follow in right behind them without having to hit your card. That's known as tailgating. You have shoulder surfing. This is pretty common. They're just looking over your information to gather passwords or information, looking over your shoulder. And then dumpster diving, where they're going to rummage through trash bins to discover financial documents and confidential other information. So for social engineering attacks, we often have the Social Engineering Toolkit, or the SET. This was designed to help white hat hackers and other network security professionals create social engineering attacks to test on their own networks. So a lot of times you can use this Social Engineering Toolkit as a means for actually carrying out a social engineering attack, but it's really meant for network engineers and cybersecurity professionals to mimic exactly what they would do in real life. And therefore, you can use it as an education to users about the risk of social engineering and developing strategies and identities over the phone and in person. So the biggest thing with cybersecurity is making sure it's only as strong as its weakest link. So that weakest link in cybersecurity is often the personnel or the people that are within the organization. And social engineering is probably the biggest threat with that with cybersecurity. One of the most effective security measures an organization can take is training its personnel and create a security-aware culture. So you'll have a lab there on social engineering as well. All right. So other attacks that we talk about are denial of service. A denial of service attack is used to create some sort of interruption in network services, either the users, devices, or maybe some applications. The idea is that you have an overwhelming quantity of traffic, and so they're sending an enormous amount of data at a rate that the network host or application can't handle it. You also have maliciously formatted packets in which that packet or the host application and receiver is unable to handle it. So they're really malformed packets that are being sent across the network. So there's a couple different terms when describing a dynamic denial of service attack. You have zombies, which are a group of compromised hosts. These hosts can run malicious code. And then you have bots, which are malware designed to infect a host and then communicate with a handler system. These together create what's called a botnet, which is a group of zombies that have been infected and using self-propagating malware and are controlled by the handlers. The handlers themselves are going to be a command and control server farm, basically controlling groups of zombies. And then you have the bot master. This enables unauthorized file transfer devices on the in sections there. So as we look over here on the right-hand side, you have the client or attacker. He's going to go out and build all these handlers. He goes out and infects a bunch of systems. These are going to be your agents or zombies that are then going to go out and hit the victim itself. This will end up obfuscating the actual attacker as a whole. So you're using a bunch of other systems to pivot and attack down here. And this is highly effective because you can send all these different servers can be from all over the world. You can purchase access to zombies on the dark web, and that will allow you to perform a much larger botnet. So Mirai is a malware that is targeted by IoT devices and configured with default log information. So yes, even a botnet can be created by your IP camera. So we infect your IP camera because you use the default password, and it can be part of that botnet attack as well. May not generate a ton of traffic, but if it's one of hundreds of thousands devices, it can generate enough traffic to cause issues. And so that botnet was part of a distributed denial of service attack that you see there, or a DDoS attack, in which it's distributed across multiple hosts. We also have buffer overflow attacks. These are used to find a system memory related flaw on a server and then exploit it. For instance, a remote denial of service attack vulnerability was discovered in Windows 10, where the threat actor created malicious code to access out of scope memory. So what that would allow them to do is gain other programs, all have their access for their individual applications. So every application has a restricted space in the RAM, and this run allowed them to get access to those restricted spaces within the memory scope. So if you had email pulled up, if you had your financial websites pulled up, you would have access to the memory and anything that was inside of there. And so another example of this buffer overflow attack is called a ping of death. This is where a threat actor will send a ping of death, which is an echo request and an IP packet that is larger than the maximum packet size on a network. Therefore, the receiving host cannot handle a packet size, and then it would crash. This is estimated to be about 1/3 of the malicious attacks are results of buffer overflows. And it's simply because there was not good code written in order to catch this type of activity. You also have some evasion methods. This is going to be both encryption and tunneling. Typically, these methods are used to hide or encrypt and scramble information in malware files, and therefore making it difficult for security detection techniques to identify this malware. And then tunneling is going to mean hiding that stolen data inside of a legitimate packet. So you could have a legitimate piece of software that's sending packets to you, and you're packaging this payload inside of that. You have resource exhaustion, which is going to be just make the target host too busy to properly use security detection techniques. So you're increasing the amount of RAM and CPU utilization on a machine. Therefore, the antivirus software or other security software is unable to see what's going on. You have traffic fragmentation. This is going to be a technique that splits a malicious payload into smaller packets and then bypass network security detection. After that fragmented packet bypasses the security detection system, the malware then reassembles that on the far side and may begin sending sensitive data outside of the network. Very similar to tunneling inside of there. You also have protocol level misinterpretation. This is when a network defenses do not properly handle features of a PDU or a protocol data unit, which is like a checksum or a TTL value. This can trick the firewall into ignoring those packets that it should be checking. You have traffic substitution. This is going to be when an invasion technique, a threat actor attempts to trick an IPS by obfuscating the data inside the payload. It's done by encoding it in a different format. So for example, it would encode the traffic in Unicode as opposed to ASCII, and therefore the IPS does not recognize the true meaning of the data, and the targeting system can read the data. Traffic insertion, this is similar to traffic substitution, but the threat actor inserts extra bytes of data in a malicious sequence of data, and therefore the IPS rules miss the malicious data, accepting the full sequence of the data. So they add a bunch of extra data just randomly in there, null packets basically that are going to keep the IPS rules from matching. Other methods are going to be pivoting. We mentioned this one earlier. This is where a threat actor will compromise an inside host and wants to expand their access further. They will then use that compromised host to gain access to an administrator password and then use that one to log into another host using the same credentials. Rootkits are going to be a complex attacker tool that's used by experienced threat actors. It typically integrates with the lowest levels of the operating system. When a program attempts to list files on the output, eliminating and incriminating information, it sanitizes things. So for example, if we use the ls command to list files, etc., it's going to compromise the actual ls program and hide the information that comes out. The goal of a rootkit is to completely hide the activities of the attacker on that local system. We also have proxies. These are going to be network traffic that's redirected through intermediate systems in order to hide and ultimately the ultimate destination for stolen data. In this way, a known command and control cannot be blocked by an enterprise because the proxy destination appears benign. And therefore, additionally, that information that's being stolen and the destination of that stolen data can be distributed among many proxies and therefore not drawing attention to a single unknown destination and serving as a destination for large amounts of traffic. So to summarize common threats and attacks, malware is going to be short for malicious software or malicious code. Most viruses are spread through USB drives and other network shares, emails, etc. Trojans are often found within online games. 3 common types of malware are the virus, worm, and Trojan horse. Threat actors can also attack the network from the outside. There's 3 major categories they use to do this: reconnaissance, access, and DOS attacks. Recon attacks precede the access or the DOS attacks. Access attacks often exploit vulnerabilities in authentication services, FTP, and web. You also have denial of service attacks, in which they create some sort of interruption with the network services, users, devices, or application. You also have distributed denial of service attacks. These are going to be similar to a DOS, except that they're increasing the magnitude and the amount of traffic from multiple coordinated accesses. This is typically done by a botnet. You have Mirai, which is some malware that targets IoT devices that are configured with their default information. And the goal of a threat actor is to use a buffer overflow in a DOS attack to find a system-related memory flaw and therefore access to the server, exploit it, and get that data back out of the RAM. And that summarizes this module.